The scent of rosemary-crusted lamb, David's favorite, wafted through the air of their meticulously curated Buckhead home. Elena straightened the silver candle holders, ensuring they were perfectly aligned with the vintage 1999 Cabernet. 25 years. She caught her reflection in the darkened window of the dining room. At 50, Elena was what the neighbors called graceful. Her hair was swept into a soft chignon, and her navy silk dress was elegant, if a bit safe. She had spent the last 2 decades being safe. She was the woman who proofread David's quarterly reports until 2 a.m., the woman who remembered his boss's wife's nut allergy, and the woman who had quietly moved their entire life 3 times to follow his promotions at Park Global. The front door chimed. Elena felt a flutter of girlish excitement. "Happy anniversary, darling," she whispered to the empty room, smoothing her skirt. David walked in, but he didn't head for the kitchen to kiss her. He didn't have flowers. He looked sharp, sharper than usual in a slim-fit Italian suit she hadn't seen before. His hair was trimmed tight, a bit too youthful for a man of 52. "You're home just in time," Elena said, her voice warm. "The lamb is resting. 25 years, David. Can you believe it?" David didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the mahogany table, looking at the silver-themed decorations as if they were artifacts from a museum he no longer visited. "Elena," he said. His voice was clinical, corporate. It was the voice he used to fire junior analysts. "Sit down." "David? What's wrong?" "I'm not going to eat the lamb, Elena, and I'm not staying." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table next to her vintage wine glass. The word divorce didn't need to be written on the outside for her to feel the cold radiation coming from the paper. Elena's heart didn't break. It went still. "Is this a joke? It's our anniversary." "It's the perfect time," David said, pacing the length of the rug she had spent 6 months sourcing from Istanbul. "It's a clean break. The kids are out of college. The house is paid for. You'll be well provided for, of course." "Provided for?" Elena's voice was a ghost of itself. "David, I built your career. I sat in the background so you could stand in the light. Who is she?" David paused, a flicker of something like guilt, or perhaps just impatience, crossing his face. "Her name is Candy. She's a lifestyle coach, a fitness influencer. She's vibrant, Elena. She's 20. 20, Elena repeated. The number felt like a slur. She wasn't even born when we bought this house. "And that's the point," David snapped, his composure finally cracking. "Look at this room, Elena. Look at you. Everything is so beige, so static. You've become stagnant. I walk into this house, and I feel like I'm walking into a funeral for my own youth." "I gave you my youth," she whispered. "No. You spent it being a shadow," he countered, leaning over the table. "You've made yourself invisible, Elena. You're a ghost in a beautiful house. I need someone who makes me feel alive, not someone who reminds me of how many years I've wasted." He checked his watch, a new high-end piece she hadn't bought him. "The movers will be here for my things tomorrow. You can have the house. I don't want the memories anyway. They're too heavy." He turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. "Don't make this difficult. You're good at being quiet, Elena. Just stay quiet. It's what you're best at." The front door clicked shut. Elena stood alone in the candlelight. The lamb was getting cold. The silver was tarnishing in the damp Atlanta heat. She looked down at the divorce papers, then at her own hands. They were trembling, but not from sadness. For 25 years, she had been the wind beneath his wings. Now the wind had stopped. But as Elena blew out the candles, plunging the room into darkness, she realized something David had forgotten. When the wind stops, the fire finally has a chance to burn. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a sea of black ties and champagne flutes, a place Elena had navigated 100 times as the perfect corporate +1. Tonight, however, the air felt thin, the light too bright. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, wearing an emerald silk dress. She shouldn't have come, but 25 years of muscle memory had driven her here. This was the Park Global Annual Charity Gala. She was supposed to be on David's arm, whispering the names of board members into his ear before he shook their hands. Instead, she saw him across the room. David was laughing, his hand resting possessively on the small of a woman's back. Candy. She was wearing a dress that was little more than a collection of sequins and hope. David looked rejuvenated. He looked like he had forgotten Elena existed. A wave of nausea hit her. Elena turned, seeking air, seeking an exit, seeking anything that wasn't the sight of her life being replaced. She pushed through a set of heavy, gold-trimmed double doors at the back of the hall, ignoring the private event sign. She found herself in a dimly lit VIP lounge that smelled of expensive tobacco and old money. The door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the roar of the party. "I told you, Uncle," a voice said, low, resonant, and cold as a winter morning in Seoul. "The board's demands for a traditional image are archaic. I lead this company with results, not a wedding ring." Elena froze. In the center of the room, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, stood a man who seemed to swallow the light around him. Jin-hyuk Park, the chairman. To the world, he was the mafia king of tech and logistics, a man who had inherited a fractured empire and glued it back together with blood and brilliance. He was younger than the board members he terrified, with sharp, predatory features and eyes that saw through everything. Opposite him stood an older man in a traditional honbak, his face twisted in a scowl. "Your cousin is already campaigning against you, Jin-hyuk. He has a wife, 3 sons, and the image of a Confucian pillar. You are a bachelor with a reputation for ruthlessness. The elders want stability. Give them a chairwoman, or give them your resignation." Elena tried to back away, her heels clicking too loudly on the polished marble. Both men turned. The older man looked annoyed. "Who is this? A servant?" Jin-hyuk Park didn't answer immediately. His dark eyes locked onto Elena's. He didn't look at her with the dismissive boredom David had shown. He looked at her with the intensity of a grandmaster studying a chess piece that had suddenly moved on its own. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands. He saw the faint red rim of her eyes, and the way she refused to let a single tear fall. Most of all, he saw the emerald silk dress, the impeccable chignon, and the aura of a woman who had spent decades mastering the art of the corporate wife. "She isn't a servant," Jin-hyuk said, his voice dropping an octave. He stepped toward her, his presence looming. "She is the wife of David Miller, one of our regional directors." Elena swallowed hard, her dignity the only thing keeping her upright. "Ex-wife," she corrected, her voice small but clear. "As of 2 hours ago." Jin-hyuk paused, his gaze raking over her again. He remembered David Miller, a loud, ambitious man who lacked subtlety. And then he looked at the woman David had discarded, a woman who radiated the exact kind of quiet, unshakable stability his board was screaming for. A slow, dangerous smile ghosted across Jin-hyuk's lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found the perfect weapon. "My apologies, Mr. Choi," Jin-hyuk said to his uncle, though his eyes never left Elena. "It seems my lack of stability has just found a solution." He walked right up to Elena, stopping well within her personal space. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloped her. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "it's Elena. Just Elena." "Elena," he repeated, the name sounding like a contract in his mouth. Your husband thinks you are invisible. He thinks you are a relic of his past. I, however, find myself in desperate need of a woman who knows how to rule a room without saying a word. A woman who knows the secrets of Park Global better than the men who run it. He leaned down, his voice a whisper near her ear. How would you like to stop being the woman behind a mid-level director and start being the woman who owns the man who fires him? Elena looked up at him, her heart thudding against her ribs. What are you asking? I am asking you to go to Korea, Jin Hyuk said, drawing back to look her in the eye. I am asking you to be my chairwoman, my wife, my shield. Behind them, his uncle sputtered in rage. Jin Hyuk, this is a scandal. She's a foreigner. She is perfect, Jin Hyuk snapped, his eyes flashing with a terrifying light. He looked back at Elena. 1 year, Elena. I get my chairmanship. You get a seat at the head of every table your husband ever dreamed of sitting at. And when we are done, you will have enough power to erase him. Elena looked through the glass doors. In the distance, she could see David laughing with his 20-year-old vibrant life. She looked back at the Mafia King, the man everyone feared, the man who was offering her a throne built on the ashes of her old life. Elena reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm. Tell me, she said, her voice turning cold and sharp as a diamond. When do we leave for Seoul? The air in Jin Hyuk Park's private office on the 50th floor was thin and smelled of ozone and expensive leather. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Atlanta looked like scattered diamonds, but inside, the atmosphere was clinical, cold, and heavy with the weight of a life-altering decision. Jin Hyuk sat behind a desk of polished black obsidian. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a boardroom ambush. He looked like a king preparing for a siege. He slid a sleek silver tablet across the desk toward Elena. The terms, he said simply. Elena didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at her hands, the hands that had folded David's shirts, packed his suitcases, and hosted his dinner parties for 25 years. Then, she looked at the screen. The numbers were staggering. The settlement for 1 year of her life was not just a comfortable retirement. It was a figure that made David's hard-earned executive salary look like pocket change. There were clauses for a private wardrobe, a staff of her own, and a title, Senior Advisor to the Chairperson. You aren't just buying a wife, Elena said, her voice regaining the steady rhythm she used when managing David's most difficult clients. You're buying a performance. You're buying a shield. I am buying your silence, your grace, and your history, Jin Hyuk corrected, leaning back. My family in Seoul is a nest of vipers. They expect me to marry a young socialite they can control, or a daughter of another conglomerate to form a merger. By bringing you, I disrupt their expectations. You are an American. You are mature. To them, you will seem like a safe, boring choice. A woman I married for stability rather than passion. They will underestimate you. He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into hers. And that is when you will help me dismantle them from the inside. Elena felt a cold shiver of excitement. For years, she had been told she was too much for the suburbs, too observant, too meticulous, too focused. David had called it nagging. Jin Hyuk was calling it a weapon. And what about David? She asked, her voice tight. He works for you. He's a director at the U.S. branch. Jin Hyuk's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with a predatory light. David Miller is a small man with small ambitions. He thinks he has ascended because he traded a used model for a newer one. He views you as a liability he has successfully liquidated. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. He was a head taller than her, a pillar of dark power. I don't just want to give you money, Elena. I want to give you a front row seat to the reality of his insignificance. In Atlanta, he is a director. In Seoul, under my roof, He is nothing. Help me secure my empire, and I will give you the power to crush the man who thinks you are nothing. By the time I am done with him, he won't just regret leaving you. He will realize that without you, he never truly existed. Elena looked at the contract. This was the miracle she had prayed for, though it had come in a much darker, sharper form than she had imagined. He called me stagnant, Elena whispered, more to herself than to him. He said I was a ghost in a beautiful house. Then let us show him what happens when a ghost decides to haunt the man who killed her, Jin Hyuk said. He held out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. Sign, Elena. Leave the invisible woman in this office. When we land in Seoul, you will be the most powerful woman in the Republic of Korea. Elena took the pen. It felt heavy, balanced, and lethal. She signed her name with the elegant cursive script she had practiced for decades on thank you notes and RSVP cards. But as she handed the pen back, she realized she wasn't signing a divorce settlement. She was signing a declaration of war. Jin Hyuk took the tablet and tapped a command. My assistant has already cleared your schedule. Your belongings will be packed and moved to a secure facility. You will take nothing from your old life. We leave for Seoul at 0400. He walked her to the door, his hand resting lightly, but firmly, on the small of her back. The touch was electric, a stark contrast to the dismissive way David had touched her for years. One more thing, Elena, Jin Hyuk said as the elevator doors opened. She turned. Yes? The woman David is with, the 20-year-old. Does she know how to manage a board of directors? Does she know how to read a balance sheet or spot a spy in a counting room? No, Elena said. She knows how to take selfies in a gym. Jin Hyuk nodded, a ghost of a smirk on his face. Good. She is a distraction. You are a partner. Sleep well, chairwoman. Your new life begins at dawn. The pre-dawn air in Atlanta was thick with humidity and the scent of cut grass, a smell that had always meant home to Elena. Now, as the black Mercedes idling at the curb waited for her, it felt like the atmosphere of a tomb. 1 minute, Elena told the driver. She stood at the end of the driveway, shielded by the shadows of the old oak trees. A U-Haul truck was backed into the driveway of the house she had spent 20 years perfecting. It was 3:15 a.m. David hadn't even waited for the divorce to be finalized to move her out. The front door opened, spilling warm yellow light onto the porch. David stepped out, wearing a t-shirt that was too tight and joggers that looked like they belonged to a teenager. He was carrying a crate of Elena's vintage crystal, the glasses they had used for every anniversary. He didn't carry them with care. He set them roughly on the edge of the truck ramp. Then came Candy. She was draped in a neon pink tracksuit, her blonde ponytail swinging as she lugged a box labeled gym gear toward the house. She laughed at something David said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. David beamed, looking at her with a terrifying, desperate hunger for a youth he could no longer claim. Elena watched as Candy tripped slightly on the welcome mat, the one Elena's mother had embroidered. Candy kicked it aside with a grimace. This thing is so tacky, Dave. We need everything new. Fresh energy, right? Whatever you want, babe. David's voice drifted through the quiet street. Out with the old. Elena felt a cold, sharp sensation in her chest. It wasn't heartbreak. It was the finality of a suture being pulled tight. She saw the man she had loved for half her life, and for the first time, she didn't see a husband. She saw a stranger who had stolen 25 years of her labor and was currently handing the keys of her kingdom to a child. She turned her back on the house. Drive, she said, as she slid into the leather interior of the Mercedes. The private terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson was a cathedral of glass and steel. Jin Hyuk Park was already there, standing at the base of a Gulfstream G650 that looked like a silver bullet aimed at the moon. He was on his phone, speaking rapid-fire Korean, but he went silent the moment Elena stepped out of the car. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a handkerchief. He simply looked at her, not at her clothes or her age, but at the iron in her eyes. You left it behind, he asked. There was nothing left to leave, Elena replied. He nodded once, a gesture of respect. Then let us begin. The flight to Incheon is 14 hours. You should sleep. When you wake up, the world will be different. The interior of the jet was a masterpiece of cream silk and polished walnut. As the engines began their low, powerful hum, a flight attendant placed a crystal flute of vintage Krug champagne on the table beside Elena. Elena looked out the window. The lights of Atlanta were shrinking into a blur of gold. Below her was the house, the neighborhood, the life where she was the invisible wife, the stagnant partner, the woman whose name was written in the margins of another man's story. She looked down at her left hand. The wedding ring, a 3-carat princess cut, felt like a shackle. It was heavy, cold, and representative of a contract that had been breached by the other party. She reached out and picked up the champagne. The bubbles danced, gold and frantic. With a slow, deliberate movement, Elena twisted the ring off her finger. For a moment, she held it over the glass, watching the light catch the diamonds one last time. Out with the old, David had said. She dropped the ring. It hit the bottom of the flute with a dull clink. The champagne surged around the gold band, the bubbles clinging to the diamonds as if trying to dissolve the memory of the last quarter century. Elena picked up the glass and took a long, slow sip. The wine was cold and crisp. Across the aisle, Jin Hyuk watched her, his dark eyes unreadable, but he raised his own glass in a silent, lethal toast. Elena didn't look back at the shrinking city. She looked forward, into the darkness of the Pacific, toward the neon skyline of Seoul, where a throne was waiting for her. The invisible woman was gone. The chairwoman had arrived. The descent into Incheon International Airport felt like falling into a different century. As the private jet pierced the layer of thick gray clouds, the sprawling hypermodernity of Seoul revealed itself. A neon-lit labyrinth of glass, steel, and high-speed motion that made Atlanta feel like a sleepy village. Welcome to the capital, Jin Hyuk said, his voice cutting through the hum of the taxing engines. He didn't look tired. He looked like a predator returning to his home range. They were whisked through a private terminal where men in sharp black suits bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched their knees. Elena's heels clicked on the pristine marble, a sound that felt louder here, more consequential. A fleet of black armored sedans waited outside, their engines purring in a synchronized, menacing rhythm. As the car sped toward Gangnam, Elena pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The city was a sensory assault. Towering digital billboards 60 stories high played loops of flawless K-pop idols and sleek tech ads. Everything was faster, tighter, and infinitely more expensive than anything she had ever known. The penthouse is in the Signal, Jin Hyuk explained, tapping a tablet. It is the highest residential point in the country. From there, you will look down on everyone. It is important you get used to the view. The glass house was an architectural marvel of cold minimalism. Situated near the top of the Lotte World Tower, the walls were entirely glass, offering a 360-degree view of the Han River and the jagged skyline. It was beautiful, but it was terrifying. There were no curtains, only smart glass that tinted at the touch of a button. There was no clutter, only vast expanses of white marble and dark basalt. "This isn't a home," Elena whispered, her voice echoing. "It's a fortress," Jin Hyuk corrected, "and for the next year it is your stage." The transformation began at 6 a.m. the following morning. Jin Hyuk didn't send a personal shopper. He sent a small army, led by a woman named Madame Kang, a legendary image consultant who had supposedly styled 3 first ladies. The team descended upon Elena with the clinical efficiency of a surgical unit. "The suburban mother aesthetic is dead," Madame Kang announced, flicking through Elena's wardrobe with a look of profound distaste. In Seoul, your clothes are your armor. You do not dress to be liked. You dress to be feared. For 3 days, Elena was poked, prodded, and polished. The look. Her soft chignon was replaced by a sharp architectural cut, a rich, dark chestnut that caught the light like polished mahogany. Her safe makeup was traded for the glass skin look of the Korean elite, luminous porcelain and intimidatingly perfect. The wardrobe, the beige silks were burned. In their place came structured blazers from Kim Akim, sharp-shouldered coats from Jaebeck Couture, and heels that looked like weapons. But the physical change was the easy part. The re-education was the true test. Every evening, Jin Hyuk sat across from her in the glass house, a bottle of expensive whiskey between them, and drilled her on the internal politics of the Park family. "My cousin, Minho," Jin Hyuk said, sliding a dossier across the table. "He is your primary target. He will look at you and see a foreign trophy wife. He will try to trip you up on the nunchi, the art of reading a room. He will use honorifics incorrectly to insult you. If you flinch, we lose." Elena spent hours memorizing the intricate web of the Park Global Board of Directors. She learned the subtle differences in Korean speech, how a single syllable could shift her status from honored guest to subordinate. She studied the financial ledgers of the subsidiaries, finding the hidden cracks she knew David was too blind to see. "You're a fast learner," Jin Hyuk remarked one night, watching her recite the lineage of the rival Hanwha group. "I spent 25 years learning how to make a mediocre man look like a genius," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the city lights below. "Learning how to make a powerful man look like a god is actually much easier." Jin Hyuk walked over to her, standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his suit. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her new, sharp jawline. "You aren't making me look like a god, Elena," he murmured, his dark eyes reflecting the neon glow of Seoul. "You're making them realize that I finally found a queen who can hold the sword." For the first time since she had been served those papers in Atlanta, Elena didn't feel like a discarded wife. She felt like a storm that was slowly gathering strength, high above the world in her house of glass. Elena stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the sleeve of Jin Hyuk's tuxedo. She was no longer the woman in the safe navy silk. She wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald velvet that clung to her silhouette like a second skin. Her hair was a sculptural wave of dark mahogany, and around her neck sat a choker of black diamonds that Jin Hyuk had placed there himself an hour ago. "Remember," Jin Hyuk whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "They are looking for a weakness. They want to see a confused American housewife. Give them nothing." "I spent 25 years being underestimated by men more arrogant than your cousin, Jin Hyuk," Elena replied, her voice low and steady. "I'm not the one who should be nervous." As they descended, the sea of black ties and designer gowns parted. The whispers followed them like a wake. "Is that her? The American? She's older than I expected. A gold digger with a good surgeon, clearly." At the base of the stairs, they were met by Minho, Jin Hyuk's cousin. He was younger, with a face that was handsome in a sharp, cruel way. Beside him stood a group of elderly board members, their faces like carved granite. "Brother," Minho said, bowing just shallowly enough to be an insult. He turned his gaze to Elena, a smirk playing on his lips. "And this must be the stabilizing influence we've heard so much about. Tell me, Elena, is it hard to adjust to a palace when you're used to what do you call them? The suburbs?" The board members watched, waiting for her to fumble, to take offense, or to miss the subtle linguistic jab in his Korean. Elena didn't blink. She offered a smile that was perfectly calibrated, not too wide, not too eager. "The suburbs were an excellent place to practice my patience, Minho, But power? Power is a language I find translates quite well across borders. She turned her attention to the man standing slightly behind Minho, Director Song, a legendary figure in the semiconductor industry and a swing vote on the board. He was holding a small decorative box, a gift Minho had clearly encouraged him to present to Jin Hyuk. Director Song, Elena said, switching to the formal John D. Mall she had practiced until her throat ached. It is an honor. I read your 2018 memoir on the reconstruction of the Han River Industries. Your chapter on silent architecture was illuminating. Song's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected the foreign trophy to know his name, let alone his bibliography. But Elena's eyes were already moving. She noticed the way Minho was watching the gift in Song's hand. She noticed the way the floral arrangement on the pedestal nearby had been changed from white lilies to red camellias. A small, seemingly aesthetic choice. Then she saw it. The gift Director Song was about to hand Jin Hyuk was wrapped in a specific shade of deep violet silk, tied with a heavy gold cord. To a casual observer, it was beautiful. To someone who had spent 20 years researching the personal histories of her husband's clients to avoid offense, it was a landmine. Director Song had lost his first wife to a tragic accident in Jeju 10 years ago. She had been a traditionalist who considered that specific color and knot combination a symbol of mourning. For Jin Hyuk to accept a congratulatory gift wrapped in the colors of Song's grief would be a catastrophic insult. Minho had set the stage. He had likely helped Song's assistant with the wrapping, knowing Jin Hyuk would be too busy to notice. Jin Hyuk, wait, Elena said, her voice a calm ripple. The circle went still. Minho's smirk faltered. Elena stepped forward, her movement fluid. She didn't take the gift. Instead, she reached into her small clutch and pulled out a delicate hand-painted fan. An antique she had insisted on buying at an auction 2 days prior. Director Song, she said softly, before you present that, I have a confession. I'm a collector of traditional textiles, and I couldn't help but notice the exquisite silk you've chosen. However, in my culture, and perhaps in your own family's history, certain shades are too heavy for such a joyful night. She expertly draped her own cream-colored silk wrap over the gift as she admired it, effectively shielding the violet silk from view. Then, she looked Song directly in the eyes, her expression one of profound, silent empathy. I heard that your late wife favored the white crane motif, she whispered, just loud enough for Song to hear. I took the liberty of having a small donation made in her name to the Seoul Arts Foundation this morning. Jin Hyuk wanted to ensure her legacy was part of our homecoming. Director Song froze. His gaze moved from the trap in his hands to Elena's face. The tension in his shoulders, the defensive crouch of a man waiting to be insulted, vanished. His eyes softened with a sudden, overwhelming respect. You remembered, Song whispered to Jin Hyuk. We remember everything, Elena replied, glancing at a now pale Minho. The rest of the night was a blur of victory. Director Song spent the next hour walking Elena through the room, introducing her to the untouchables of the board as the most perceptive woman I have met in a decade. Later, in the back of the armored sedan as they sped away from the hotel, the silence between Elena and Jin Hyuk was different. It wasn't the silence of two strangers in a contract. Jin Hyuk loosened his tie, staring out at the Han River. How did you know about the silk? My briefing files didn't include the color of Song's morning rituals. Your files focus on balance sheets and enemies, Elena said, leaning her head back against the leather. I spent my life focusing on the things men think are too small to matter, the invisible details. That's where the real power lives. Jin Hyuk turned to look at her. The cold, mechanical distance in his eyes had been replaced by something sharp and burning. Curiosity. He reached out, his fingers brushing the velvet on her shoulder. I hired you to be a shield, Elena, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. I didn't realize I was hiring a general. Elena looked at him, the lights of the city reflecting in her eyes. Then you'd better start listening to my reports, Chairman, because we've only just started winning. Jin Hyuk didn't pull his hand away. For the first time, he didn't see a pawn. He saw a partner. And for the first time, Elena realized that the revenge she wanted was going to taste much better than she had ever imagined. The rain in Seoul didn't fall. It descended like a heavy gray curtain, blurring the neon lights of Gangnam into smears of electric blue and violent pink. High above the chaos, in the silent, pressurized sanctuary of the Signal penthouse, Elena stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass. In the reflection of the window, she saw him. Jin Hyuk was sitting on the low basalt gray sofa, his jacket discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that were corded like a fighter's. He wasn't looking at a tablet or a ledger for once. He was simply staring into a glass of amber liquid, his expression one of profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The gala took more out of you than I thought, Elena said softly, turning away from the rain. It wasn't the gala, Jin Hyuk replied, his voice a low rasp. It's the masquerade. Every day I wake up and put on the mask of the man who can't be broken. The mafia king. The man who would trade his own mother for a 2% rise in market share. Elena walked over, but she didn't sit next to him. She sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing him, within his space, but respectful of the walls he built. Is that who you are? Or is that just who they need to fear? Jin Hyuk looked up, and for the first time, the predatory sharpness in his eyes was gone. In its place was a haunting emptiness. When my father died, the board didn't mourn. They circled. My cousins tried to have my car run off the Han River Bridge. My allies began selling off my assets before the body was cold. I didn't choose to be a monster, Elena. I became one so I wouldn't become a ghost. He leaned back, his head hitting the cushion with a thud. They call me the Mafia King because it's easier than admitting they created me. But the higher the throne, the colder the air. Sometimes I forget what it's like to speak to someone who isn't trying to calculate my expiration date. Elena reached out. It was a gamble, a breach of the professional distance they had maintained. She rested her hand over his on the sofa. His skin was warm, his pulse steady, but she felt the slight tremor of tension in his muscles. I'm not calculating your expiration date, Jin Hyuk, she whispered. I'm the only person in the city who doesn't want anything from you that isn't already in the contract. Jin Hyuk's hand turned over, his fingers lacing through hers. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't let go. The silence between them shifted from the quiet of two strangers to the intimacy of two survivors. The contract, he murmured, looking at their joined hands. It feels like a lifetime ago that I offered it to you in that VIP lounge. It was only 3 weeks, she reminded him. And yet, he said, looking up at her, his gaze intense and uncomfortably honest, I find I can no longer remember what this penthouse felt like before you arrived. It was just a glass box. Now, it feels occupied. The air between them grew thick, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a summer storm. For a moment, Elena thought he might lean forward. She thought she might let him. The fake nature of their arrangement was fraying at the edges, worn thin by late-night briefings and shared victories. But Jin Hyuk pulled back, though he didn't release her hand. Instead, he reached for a heavy leather folder on the table with his free hand and slid it toward her. I didn't just want to talk to you tonight, he said, his chairman voice returning, though it was softer now. I wanted to finalize a change in our arrangement. Elena opened the folder. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a gift of jewelry or a car. It was a deed of transfer. Jin Hyuk had signed over a 40% stake in PG Logistics, a massive subsidiary that handled all North American shipping and supply chain operations for the entire empire. This is... Elena stammered, scanning the legal jargon. Jin Hyuk, this makes me the majority shareholder of the division David works for. Exactly, Jin Hyuk said, a cold, satisfied smirk touching his lips. You are no longer just a proxy or a representative. You are now a board-level executive in your own right. When the time comes to face your ex-husband, you won't be standing next to me as my wife. You will be standing above him as his employer. He squeezed her hand once, firmly, before finally letting go. I don't give power away lightly, Elena. I'm giving this to you because you proved at the gala that you can handle it. And because... He paused, looking back out at the rain. Because I want you to have a reason to stay that has nothing to do with the settlement. Elena looked from the documents to the man beside her. She had come to Korea for revenge, for a way to rebuild her shattered ego. But as she looked at Jin Hyuk, this mafia king, who had just handed her a sword of her own, she realized the stakes had changed. She wasn't just playing a part anymore. She was becoming the person she was always meant to be. And the man sitting next to her was no longer just a boss. He was her accomplice. Thank you, Jin Hyuk, she said, her voice sounding like the chairwoman she was becoming. Don't thank me yet, he replied, his eyes flashing with a familiar, dangerous light. Tomorrow, we start the bait phase. David is arriving in Seoul in 48 hours. Are you ready to go fishing? Elena smiled, and this time the coldness in it matched his own. I've been ready for 25 years. The air in David Miller's Atlanta office was thick with the smell of stale espresso and the frantic mounting scent of failure. For 3 weeks, David had been drowning. He had never realized how much of his genius had actually been Elena's meticulous editing, her quiet reminders of deadlines, and her uncanny ability to smooth over his blunt emails before he hit send. Now his inbox was a graveyard of please clarify messages from the Seoul headquarters. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a notification from Candy's Instagram. She had posted a video of them at brunch, complaining that he was too stressed and needed to vibe more. David looked at the screen, then at the mountain of logistics reports he didn't understand. The vibrant life he had traded everything for felt increasingly like a neon-colored headache. Suddenly, his desk phone rang. The caller ID displayed a restricted international number. This is David Miller, he said, straightening his tie out of habit. Mr. Miller? A voice clipped with the precision of a diamond-edged blade spoke. It was Jin Hyuk Park's head of operations. The chairman has been reviewing the North American logistics portfolios. He's intrigued by your recent projections. David's heart hammered. He is? He believes you have a unique perspective that the local branch is stifling. There is a special project, a global bridge initiative. It requires a final presentation to the board of directors in Seoul. The chairman has personally requested you to lead the pitch. If successful, it means a vice presidency and a permanent relocation to the global headquarters. David felt a surge of pure, intoxicating ego. I knew it, he thought. Elena was the one holding me back. My energy is finally being recognized. I can be there by the end of the week, David stammered. Excellent. We've booked 2 first-class tickets. The chairman understands you've recently updated your domestic situation. He invites you to bring your partner. It's a celebratory atmosphere. The digital echo. 16 hours later, in the quiet, high-tech command center of the Signal penthouse, a wall-sized screen flickered to life. He took it, Jin Hyuk said, leaning against the doorframe with a cup of black coffee. Elena didn't look up from her tablet. She was dressed in a sleek ivory silk robe, her face a mask of cool professional focus. He was always a sucker for the word special. It bypasses his logic and goes straight to his vanity. Look at this, Jin Hyuk said, tapping a command on his remote. The screen displayed a screenshot from Candy's public Instagram profile. It was a photo of 2 first-class boarding passes rested against a designer carry-on bag. At Candy_C_vibes, Big things happening. Soul bound for Dave's huge promotion. When you level up your life, the universe levels up your career. See ya, Atlanta. Hashtag boss babe. Hashtag soul searching. Hashtag power couple. Hashtag new chapter. Elena stared at the screen. She looked at the man she had been married to for 25 years. The man who was currently telling the world that his success was a result of his new, younger energy, rather than the woman who had built his foundation. He thinks he's coming here to be crowned, Elena said, her voice like cracking ice. He's coming here to be liquidated, Jin-hyuk replied. He walked over to her, his hand resting on the back of her chair. I've arranged for them to stay at the Grand Hyatt. I've even leaked to the local press that a rising American star is arriving for a secret project. I want him to feel like a god before we drop him. Elena stood up, turning to face the window. Below her, the city of Seoul was a sprawling, shimmering web. David was currently somewhere over the Pacific, drinking champagne and bragging to a 20-year-old about how he had finally made it. He had no idea that he was flying into a cage. He had no idea that the special project was a fiction designed to bring him to her feet. And most of all, he had no idea that the woman he called stagnant was now the person who signed his paychecks. He's going to post every moment of it, isn't he? Elena asked. Every single one, Jin-hyuk said. By the time he walks into that boardroom, his digital footprint will be a map of his own arrogance. It will make the fall so much more cinematic. Elena felt a strange, cold calm. The bait was set. The trap was open. Let him have his flight, she whispered. The landing is going to be the hardest thing he's ever experienced. The humidity of a Seoul summer hit David Miller like a physical blow the moment he stepped out of the air-conditioned sanctuary of Incheon International Airport. He had expected a limousine with a chauffeur holding a sign with his name in gold foil. Instead, he found himself standing at a crowded taxi stand, his $2,000 Italian suit already beginning to wilt in the damp heat. Davy, where's the car? Candy whined, adjusting the strap of her neon green crop top. Her skin, usually glowing in the filtered light of her Instagram stories, looked sallow and oily under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal. You said we were VIPs. This place is like super loud and everyone is pushing. There's probably just a delay with the executive fleet, David muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He tried to catch the eye of a passing airport official, but the man moved past him without a second glance. In Atlanta, David was a director. Here, he was just another sweating tourist in a sea of 10 million people. They eventually squeezed into a standard silver taxi. The driver spoke no English, and David's attempt at hello was met with a gruff, disinterested grunt. As they crawled onto the Olympic Highway, the legendary Seoul traffic swallowed them whole. For 2 hours, they sat bumper to bumper with thousands of other cars, the view blocked by massive gray sound barriers and towering apartment blocks that seemed to stretch into infinity. It's so gray, Candy pouted, her thumb scrolling frantically through her phone. My roaming isn't working, and I can't find any vibe spots. Are you sure this is the right city? David didn't answer. He was staring at the GPS on his phone, feeling smaller with every kilometer. He was a man who had traded his history for a fresh start, but as he looked at the sprawling, incomprehensible metropolis around him, he felt less like a conqueror and more like an ant. 2,000 feet above. In the silent, darkened lounge of the Signal penthouse, the world was a different color. Elena sat in a high-back leather chair, a glass of chilled white tea in her hand. On the wall-sized digital screen in front of her, a high-definition drone feed tracked a silver taxi moving slowly across the Mapo Bridge. The technology was part of the Park Global security grid, a bird's-eye view of the empire that Jin-hyuk navigated like a god. Jin-hyuk stood behind her, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the screen. Zoom in, he commanded softly. The image stabilized and enlarged. Through the rear window of the taxi, David's face became visible. He looked old. The youthful vibrancy he had boasted about in Atlanta had been replaced by a look of panicked confusion. Beside him, Candy was mid-complaint, her mouth moving in a silent, jagged rhythm. "He looks pathetic," Jin-hyuk remarked. Elena leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the man she had loved for half her life. She looked at the way his hand gripped the door handle, the way his eyes darted around the skyline, searching for something familiar. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had walked out of a stable life and into a storm he wasn't equipped to weather. "He's looking for the special project," Elena said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "He's looking for the red carpet." "The red carpet doesn't start until he reaches the Hyatt," Jin-hyuk said, a cold smile playing on his lips. "And even then, the carpet is a trap. I've ensured the hotel staff treats them with efficient indifference. I want them to feel the weight of their own insignificance before they see you." He placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. She didn't pull away. The touch was grounding, a reminder of the power she now wielded. "Does it hurt?" Jin-hyuk asked, seeing him like that. Elena watched as David wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, the one she had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. She watched him check his watch, the one he thought made him look like a CEO. "No," Elena replied, her voice steady. "It feels like watching a movie I've already seen. I know how it ends for the villain." She tapped a button on the arm of her chair, and the drone feed switched to a different angle, showing the taxi pulling into the driveway of the Grand Hyatt. From this height, David and Candy looked like two tiny, insignificant dots stepping out into a world that didn't know their names and didn't care to learn them. Elena took a slow sip of her tea, the cold liquid sharp against her tongue. "Welcome to Seoul, David," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope you enjoyed the ride, because from here, the only way is down." The top floor of the Park Global headquarters was a fortress of frosted glass and silence. David Miller walked down the corridor, his footsteps muffled by the thick slate-gray carpet. He adjusted his tie in the reflection of a glass wall. He looked good, or so he told himself. He felt like a gladiator entering the Colosseum, certain of his victory. He clutched his silver laptop case like a shield. This was the moment he would finally ascend. No more suburban mediocrity. No more boring life. He was about to become a vice president in the most powerful conglomerate in Asia. 2 silent guards opened the massive mahogany doors to the executive boardroom. The room was vast, dominated by a U-shaped table of black obsidian. At the far end, framed by a panoramic view of the Seoul skyline, sat Jin-hyuk Park. He looked like a dark god carved from ice. To his left and right sat the board of directors, men whose net worths could buy small countries. David strode in, a practiced, confident smile on his face. "Chairman Park, board members, it is an honor to be here. I've prepared a presentation that I believe will revolutionize our North American corridor." Jin-hyuk didn't smile back. He didn't even nod. He simply gestured to the empty space at the base of the table. "Please, Mr. Miller, set up. We are waiting for the final member of our committee." David began to unpack his laptop, his hands slightly trembling with adrenaline. He looked at the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, currently turned toward the window, obscuring the person sitting in it. He assumed it was a senior advisor or perhaps a legal consultant. "I've spent 25 years in logistics," David began, his voice booming with a false bravado, "and I've learned that growth requires cutting away the old to make room for the new. My vision for Park Global is—" "Efficiency?" a voice interrupted. The voice was cool, melodic, and terrifyingly familiar. David froze. The laptop slipped an inch in his grip. He knew that voice, but it couldn't be. That voice belonged in a kitchen in Atlanta. That voice belonged to a woman who wore beige sweaters and worried about the gardener. Actually, Mr. Miller, Jin Hyuk said, his voice dropping into a low, lethal purr. Before you begin, I should introduce our new majority stakeholder and the chairwoman of this committee, my wife. The high-backed chair began to swivel, slowly, deliberately. David's breath hitched in his throat. The woman who emerged from the shadows wasn't Elena. Not his Elena. This woman was a vision in structured Chanel, a cream-colored suit with gold buttons that looked like armor. Her hair was a sharp, glossy bob that framed a face that looked decades younger, radiant with the glass skin glow of the Seoul elite. Her eyes, once soft and pleading, were now two chips of cold, piercing diamond. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the obsidian table, her chin perched on interlaced fingers, a massive emerald ring, the color of envy and rebirth, flashed on her left hand. "Hello, David," Elena said. The silence that followed was absolute. David's brain refused to process the image. He looked for the stagnant wife he had discarded. He looked for the invisible woman. He found only a queen. "Elena," he stammered, his voice cracking. What are you doing here? This is a business meeting. You're supposed to be—" "I'm supposed to be where I belong," Elena interrupted, her gaze never wavering, "at the head of the table, which, as it turns out, is directly above you." Jin Hyuk leaned back, a look of savage pride on his face. "My wife is the majority shareholder of the subsidiary you work for, David. In fact, she is the one who suggested this special project." Elena's lips curled into a faint, devastating smile. "I wanted to see the vibrancy you were so proud of, David. I wanted to see the new energy that was going to revolutionize the industry." She looked down at his laptop, then back at his pale, sweating face. "Is this it? Because from where I'm sitting, you look stagnant." The shock finally broke his physical coordination. David's grip failed. The silver laptop hit the marble floor with a sickening, metallic crunch. The screen shattered, the light dying instantly. David didn't pick it up. He couldn't move. He stood there, humiliated in front of the most powerful men in Korea, staring at the woman he had treated like a ghost, only to realize she was the one who held his life in her hands. "You're fired, David," Elena said softly. "You can't do that," David gasped. "I've given 25 years to this company." "No," Elena corrected, standing up and smoothing her skirt with an air of finality. "I gave 25 years to this company. You just took the credit. And today, I'm taking it back." She looked at Jin Hyuk. "I believe we're done here, darling. The air in this room has become quite boring." Jin Hyuk stood, his hand sliding possessively around Elena's waist. He looked at David as if he were a stain on the rug. "Security will escort you to the Hyatt to collect your things. Your flight back to Atlanta leaves in 3 hours. Economy class, of course." As they walked past him, the scent of Elena's expensive floral perfume, something rare and commanding, filled David's lungs, a final suffocating reminder of everything he had lost. Elena didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already moved on to a world where he didn't exist. The luxury suite at the Grand Hyatt, which had felt like a victory lap only 24 hours ago, now felt like a gilded cage. David paced the length of the plush carpet, his phone pressed to his ear, listening to the monotonous ring of his corporate account manager in Atlanta. "Disconnected?" he whispered, staring at the screen. "How can it be disconnected? Davy, what is going on?" Candy sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, surrounded by shopping bags from Myeongdong that she hadn't yet opened. Her usual high-energy pout was curdling into genuine irritation. "My card just got declined at the hotel spa, in front of everyone. It was so embarrassing." I'm sure it's just a banking error, David snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. The door to the suite chimed, not the gentle ring of room service, but a sharp, authoritative double knock. David rushed to open it, expecting a concierge with an apology. Instead, he found a man in a charcoal suit, one of CEO Park's personal legal attachés, holding a leather portfolio. Beside him, leaning against the doorframe with the casual grace of a panther, was Jin Hyuk. And behind them, dressed in a black silk trench coat that looked like liquid midnight, was Elena. We need to discuss your transition, David, Elena said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. My transition? David's voice went up an octave. Elena, listen to me. That boardroom stunt. I don't know what kind of game you're playing with Mr. Park, but you can't just fire me. I have a contract. You had a contract, the lawyer interrupted, sliding a document onto the marble console. Clause 14.2, termination for gross professional negligence and reputational damage. Your special project presentation was recorded and archived. It was a failure of such magnitude that it triggered an immediate nullification of your benefits. David's face went white. Benefits? What about my severance? My stock options? Clawbacked, Jin Hyuk said, his voice flat and bored. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city as if the drama behind him was beneath his notice. You've been a liability to this company for years, Miller. My wife was the only reason you weren't purged a decade ago. Now that she's the one holding the pen, she's simply correcting the books. Elena walked toward the bed. Candy shrunk back, looking at Elena with a mixture of awe and terror. And then there's the matter of the house, Elena said softly. David froze. The house is mine. I kept it in the settlement. You kept the title, David, Elena corrected. But according to the records I pulled this morning, you took out a massive home equity line of credit 3 weeks ago to fund a lifestyle brand for your new partner, I believe. Candy looked away, suddenly very interested in her manicure. I bought the debt, David, Elena continued, through a holding company. Your mortgage, your lines of credit, even the lease on that sports car you left in the driveway in Atlanta. I own it all. And as of 10 minutes ago, I've initiated foreclosure proceedings. You aren't just unemployed, David. You're homeless. The silence in the room was deafening. Candy stood up, her eyes darting between David's shattered expression and Elena's diamond-hard composure. She didn't say a word. She didn't offer a hand of comfort. She simply grabbed her designer carry-on and began stuffing her unopened shopping bags into it. Candy? What are you doing? David gasped. Dave, I'm a lifestyle coach, Candy said, her voice devoid of its usual breathy sweetness. And this? This is not a lifestyle. You said you were a king. You're just a guy who got fired by his wife. She zipped her bag with a definitive snap. I have a flight to catch. I think my ex-boyfriend is still in Miami. As the door clicked shut behind Candy, David collapsed into a chair. The silence of the room felt like it was crushing him. He looked up at Elena, his eyes welling with a desperate, pathetic hope. Elena, please, he choked out. I made a mistake. I was lost. But 25 years. We have 25 years of history. The kids, the holidays, the way we used to talk about retiring in Tuscany. You can't just erase all of that. For the sake of our history, help me. Elena stood perfectly still. She looked down at him, and for a moment, David thought he saw a flicker of the old Elena, the one who would have forgiven him anything. But then she tilted her head, a look of genuine clinical curiosity on her face. History? She asked. I'm sorry, I think you're mistaken. She stepped closer, leaning down until she was eye level with him. Her expression was as blank as a fresh sheet of snow. I remember a man who told me I was stagnant. I remember a man who told me I was a ghost. I remember a man who said I was invisible. She straightened her coat, the silk whispering against her skin. She reached out and took Jin Hyuk's hand, their fingers interlacing with a familiarity that felt like a brand. "But you," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of pure indifference. "I don't remember you at all." She turned and walked out of the suite, Jin Hyuk's hand in hers. David sat in the center of the luxury he could no longer afford, surrounded by the ghosts of a life he had thrown away, and realized that the worst thing she could have done wasn't to hate him. It was to forget him. A year in Seoul had changed the very composition of Elena's soul. The soft, accommodating edges of the suburban wife had been forged into something tempered and sharp. As she stood in the center of the Signal penthouse, the winter sun reflecting off the Han River far below, she looked at the woman in the mirror. She wore a suit of midnight blue wool, tailored so perfectly it felt like a second skin. Her eyes were calm, her posture sovereign. She was no longer a woman waiting for a miracle. She was the miracle. The door chimes echoed through the high ceiling space. Jin Hyuk entered, shedding his overcoat. He looked at her, and for a heartbeat, the Mafia King mask slipped. There was a profound, quiet heat in his gaze that had nothing to do with corporate mergers. On the obsidian desk sat a single cream-colored folder. "It's been exactly 365 days, Jin Hyuk said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. Elena nodded. "The contract is complete. The board is stabilized. Your cousin is in permanent consultative exile in Europe, and the North American division has seen its most profitable quarter in a decade." Jin Hyuk walked to the desk but didn't pick up the folder. Instead, he slid 2 separate documents toward her. "The first," he said, "is your exit. The settlement has been tripled. You have billions in your own accounts, property in Jeju, London, and New York, and a seat on 3 international boards. You can walk out of this door and never look back. You can buy 1,000 houses in Atlanta and never see a ghost again." Elena looked at the paper. It was freedom. It was the happily ever after she thought she wanted when she was crying over cold lamb a year ago. "And the second?" she asked, her voice steady. Jin Hyuk stepped closer, his presence enveloping her. He held out a second document. It was shorter, only a single page. "A new contract," he murmured. "No expiration date, no settlement figures, because everything I own is already yours. It's a partnership agreement, Elena. In the boardroom, in this house, and in everything that comes next." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers with a vulnerability he showed no one else. "I hired a proxy to save my throne. I ended up finding the only person who makes the throne worth sitting on. I don't want a shield anymore, Elena. I want a queen." Elena looked at the 2 papers. The path back to a life of quiet luxury, and the path forward into the storm of an empire. She realized then that she hadn't just used Jin Hyuk to get revenge on David. Revenge had been the catalyst, but the result was something much more terrifying and beautiful. She hadn't married a boss. She had discovered that she was one. David hadn't made her invisible. He had simply been too small to see her. Elena picked up the fountain pen, the same gold-plated one she had used to sign her life away in Atlanta. She didn't sign the exit papers. With a slow, deliberate movement, she tore the settlement offer in half and let the pieces flutter to the marble floor like snow. Then, she signed the new contract with a flourish that was bold and final. "The terms are acceptable," she said, looking up at him. Jin Hyuk didn't celebrate with words. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck as he drew her into a kiss that tasted of victory and a dark, enduring promise. They walked together out onto the glass-walled balcony. The wind was biting, but neither of them felt the cold. Below them, Seoul glittered, a sprawling, neon-lit kingdom of 10 million souls, all of them beneath their feet. In the distance, Elena could see the lights of the airport where, a year ago, she had arrived as a broken woman. Somewhere in the world, David was struggling to pay rent, and Candy was looking for a new mark. But from this height, they weren't even specks. They were nothing. Jin Hyuk leaned against the railing, his shoulder brushing hers. "What are you thinking about, chairwoman?" Elena looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the sea, feeling the weight of the black diamonds around her neck and the even heavier weight of the power in her hands. "I'm thinking," she said, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips, "that it's a beautiful night to start an empire." Jin Hyuk laughed, a rare, genuine sound, and pulled her closer. They stood there, two predators overlooking their territory, partners in every sense of the word, watching the sun set on the old world and rise on the new. The air on Jeju Island smelled of salt and the sweet citrus scent of halabong blossoms. Far below the basalt cliffs of the Park family estate, the East China Sea churned in shades of turquoise and deep sapphire. It had been exactly 3 years since a woman named Elena Miller had boarded a plane in Atlanta with nothing but a glass of champagne and a heart full of glass shards. Today, there was no Elena Miller. The woman standing before the floor-to-ceiling mirror was Elena Park, the chairwoman of Park Global's International Logistics Wing, a woman whose name was spoken with hushed reverence in boardrooms from London to Singapore. She wore a gown of tiered white silk that looked like sea foam, designed by a woman who usually only dressed royalty. There were no crowds today, no cameras, no board members calculating their next move. "You're late," a voice rumbled from the doorway. Elena turned. Jin Hyuk stood there, looking far more relaxed than the mafia king the world feared. He had discarded his tie, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. In his hand, he held 2 glasses of the same vintage Krug they had shared on the jet 3 years ago. "I wasn't late," Elena said, a playful spark in her eyes. "I was reflecting. This is technically our second wedding, isn't it?" "The first one was a merger," Jin Hyuk said, stepping into the room and handing her a glass. "This one is a surrender." He walked behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. He looked at her reflection, not as a piece on a chessboard, but as his North Star. "I received a report this morning," he said softly, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, "from the Atlanta office." Elena didn't tense. The mention of her old life no longer had the power to sting. And? David was spotted at a strip mall recruitment fair. He was applying for a junior dispatch role. He tried to use his history as a director to get a higher salary. They laughed him out of the room. Elena took a slow sip of her champagne. She thought of the man who had told her she was invisible. She thought of the beige life she had once thought was enough. "I hope he finds what he's looking for," she said, and she truly meant it. She didn't want him to suffer. She simply didn't want him to matter. And in her world, he was now less than a footnote. Jin Hyuk turned her around to face him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside wasn't just a ring. It was a seal, engraved with a new crest, a fusion of their initials, entwined with the symbol of a phoenix. "The board wanted me to marry a woman who would keep me stable," Jin Hyuk whispered, sliding the ring onto her finger. "Instead, I married the woman who taught me how to burn." "Are you ready?" she asked. "For the ceremony?" "For the rest of it," she said, gesturing to the horizon. "The expansion, the legacy, the empire we're building that has nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with us." Jin Hyuk smiled. The rare, breathtaking smile that belonged only to her. He led her out onto the terrace where a simple altar stood against the backdrop of the infinite sea. There were no vows about obeying or supporting. Instead, they spoke of partnership, of equal weight, and of a fire that would never be extinguished. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violent violet, Elena Park looked out at the world she had conquered. She realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't the billions in the bank or the fall of her ex-husband. The greatest revenge was the fact that she had finally become the woman she was always meant to be, a woman who didn't need a miracle because she had become one herself. She took her husband's hand, and together they stepped into the light of a future where they weren't just the king and queen of an empire. They were finally beautifully home. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.